Hello, Jake.
Hello, Michael.
Thanks for joining me. This
It is. It is.
is.
I was gonna say, it is my pleasure and an honor to be on your YouTube channel.
Thank you. It's funny because this is the first time I'm hosting someone on my YouTube channel, and it's not a podcast, it's not anything else, it's a conversation, and yet there's this air of like formality because like we're doing a special thing, even though we've had a bunch of conversations like every week for the last year. Now it's like a thing, and I'm just enjoying leaning
Yeah.
into that experience of thingness almost.
We'll see if we can practice what you preach and and be as smooth as possible with it. And try to let
Okay,
some of it go.
it sounds good. So I was thinking, since this is going on my YouTube channel and not yours, although this would be the most hilarious part three I could imagine, um, it, it might make sense.
Major pivot. Yeah.
Yeah, it might make sense for you to just introduce yourself to whoever's watching. Who are you, in whatever way you want to say, like, what feels good. Who are you?
Cool. Okay. I'm Jake Orthwein. I should probably say what you're alluding to with respect to part three. So I also have a YouTube channel where I make video essays and am in the middle of a very long and laborious series here, for which part three is as yet missing, but coming soon, I hope. That YouTube channel is called Frame Problems, and my I guess I've known Michael for a couple of years, been interested in what he's been doing around Alexander technique, but my special interest has been comparing and contrasting it with what I've learned in a meditation context. So I've been practicing meditation for probably about 8 or 9 years or so now, mostly in either a Vipassana context or what are called non-dual practices, which I'm sure we'll get into here. And I've just found lots of interesting overlap between what Michael's teaching in Alexander technique and that stuff. And he and I have spoken a little bit about it. And I know in the Twitter sphere, there's lots of intrigue about, to what extent there is overlap and yeah, what the relationship is between AT as Michael teaches it in a sort of very awareness centric way and different meditation practices. So that's
Awesome.
what brings me here.
Thank you. And yeah, for those stumbling upon this, or for anyone who Jake shares this with, my name is Michael Ashcroft, and I'm an Alexander Technique teacher. I have an online course called Expanding Awareness, which is how it's actually not called that. I keep doing this because I've called it Fundamentals of Alexander
I,
Technique, and everyone else calls it Expanding Awareness because my website is called
I
Expanding
also made
Awareness.
that. I went looking at it for today,
Yeah.
and I searched in my email expanding awareness, and
Yeah.
and was quickly corrected. Yeah.
I really need to sort this out because I've now been gaslighted by everyone else. Like, this is what I've called it, and I haven't called it this. There's a reason for this, and I'll get into that.
Yeah.
But I teach this thing called Alexander Technique, which is normally taught in person and through touch, and I teach online and through awareness-based skills. And I'm curious about the overlaps between all of that and all of the vast Dharma type practices that exist out there. The interesting thing for me is that when Afim Alexander developed his technique, to my knowledge, there had been no traveling of Dharma teachings into the West. He did it all before then. And the extent to which he taught it as an awareness-based skill is not clear because his books aren't exactly easy to read. But I suspect there's a lot more overlap than we might think. So yeah.
What year was this? That out of curiosity, because was it in the 20s or something when he first
Yeah, it was
pioneered it?
around
Or
turn of the century. So he came to London to teach the stuff in the 20s, I think. And he'd been developing before that in Tasmania, of all places, in Australia. So
Interesting.
I don't believe that Dharmic stuff had reached Tasmania in the 1900s and 10s. My understanding is that the Buddhist Society in London actually is one of the first Western Buddhist societies, and that was in the 30s, I think. That's where Alan
Yeah.
Watts actually went to meet Christmas Humphreys, the founder of the Buddhist Society,
Oh
as a
wow.
child.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I know there were sort of like there were some like hucksters sort of in the early days of
Okay.
people who are at least ostensibly bringing Eastern teachings, but I think you're right that Buddhism under the name Buddhism came later. But like there's like the Theosophical Society and some of these like sort of
Yeah.
Eastern influenced woo that would have been or that whole turn of the century period sort of had lots of interesting ideas in the air, and I can't remember where I read something about this, but there's basically this sort of there was so much change going on and so many sort of revisions in our fundamental picture of the world
Mm.
that you'd have the same people doing, the most interesting fundamental research in physics or whatever else, and being interested in the occult and the two were sort of commingled in interesting ways because nobody knew what of all these new and exotic ideas were going to be the ones that stuck and the ones that withstood some rigor. So it sounds like an interesting time.
Yeah, absolutely. It's funny that you mentioned the Theosophical Society. I went to their building in London to do a meditation course before I was more able to tolerate woo, put it that way. I was more kind of physics degree student at that point, I think, or shortly thereafter. And they told us to take off our shoes because rubber blocks the flow of energy. And I was like,
of course,
please say different things. And it was interesting because I think it touches on that mixing up of let's say physics and spiritual practice and other stuff that we learn about from Eastern traditions in a way that didn't land for me at the time, but I can kind of see what they were aiming at anyway.
Well, yeah, I suspect you could probably make sense of that instruction now as long as you didn't try to translate it into physics language.
Exactly.
There's something to it, maybe, but yeah.
Exactly, and that's something we can dig into as well. Actually, there's something I found when I teach Alexander technique and in my style of awareness-based stuff. I don't use Buddhist language. And I find some people find that more accessible, as opposed to I'm reading Seeing That Frees by Robert Bayer right now, and I've read various other meditation books, and they are full of like Sanskrit and Pali words and all kinds of jargon that I think is a bit of a barrier to entry if you're kind of like, why do I have to learn a different language to learn how to do this meditation thing? So I wonder if there's a more direct ways in that are like Western friendly almost, that kind of cater to people who don't want to have to learn a tradition that comes from the East.
Yeah, I mean, and I think insofar as like what's being pointed to is true of awareness, it shouldn't be bound in any special way to the Buddhist tradition. The kind of what you said is definitely true in that I see plenty of people in the Twitter sphere, for example, who would have bounced off of different kinds of Buddhist ways of putting these things, that when it's framed in the language of here's one weird trick you can do with your mind, will then find themselves in like dramatic experiences that they wouldn't have been able to sort of make themselves become interested in, were it not for the fact that the language seems so unthreatening and accessible. And yeah, so there's definitely something to be said for translating it. One sort of, it's not necessarily a downside, but it's just like a sort of interesting thread that I'm sure we'll get into in this conversation, is whether taking it out of its original context, its sort of religious or like spiritual context, puts a cap on the sense of the possibility of it, right? Because like at least in the Buddhist view, it's like it's a explicitly soteriological, like salvation based project, where it's like you can go all the way to the end of the road with this in some sense. So at least that's the traditional promise. And this is a critique that gets levied against McMindfulness too, is that you try to secularize it and you try to sort of make it accessible to a broader audience, and at the same time people come to believe that all that it's good for is alleviating a little bit of stress, and don't sort of develop a sense of how deep the path or how long the path runs because of that. But yeah,
absolutely. And you've inspired me, I think, to start making clickbaity listicles of 10 mental awareness tricks that will blow your mind. Like, number 7 will shock you, kind of thing, as a way into this stuff.
Number 7 will permanently awaken you from the illusion of samsara.
Yeah, perhaps not. There's something actually I'm thinking about more and more in translation of things from Buddhist traditions and elsewhere, of course, is the question of safety. The idea of like, what is safe to do? What are the practices around what is safe? Because in Buddhist practices, you can go quite deep and quite a long way, and you've also got the Noble Eightfold Path. You've got you've got ethics,
scaffolding,
you've got practice. You've got all kinds of safety mechanisms that might either put people off kind of going too far, or if they do go too far, then or go that far, then they've got these various mechanisms and communities and things around them. Now, I've never known anyone to have any kind of issues from Alexander technique, but it's something I'm aware of in the background of other practices have these safety mechanisms built in. What are they for? What's behind them, and how can I kind of bring them into my practice if I need to? But there's a thing in my mind of secularizing a tradition into, let's say, English language is one thing, whereas from my perspective, the thing I'm teaching was fully developed in the West. And it's not a kind of translation. It's a separate derivation almost. So I'm wondering what the implications of that are ultimately, where these things do intersect.
Well, but do you think? I don't know anything about FM Alexander's influences. So did he, was he sort of part of the various currents of weird things coming from the East at the time? Do you
No.
know what, he just sort of independently discovered these things in his own mind, or?
Well, the way his story goes, I've seen no indication that he had any interaction with anything of the theosophical kind. Basically, no, he's never mentioned it in any of his books. His story was
Very
that he
intriguing.
was an actor, basically, and he was in Tasmania and he lost his voice. He realized that he was straining his voice himself when he was speaking, and he couldn't stop doing it ultimately. And
Hmm.
that led him to kind of dig into what was the trigger inside of him that led him to respond a certain kind of way, and why couldn't he stop doing it? And in fact, the harder he tried to stop doing it, the more he did the thing that he was trying to avoid. Like he was leaning in
Hmm.
harder and emphasizing the thing he didn't want to do. So he
Yeah.
learned this skill of, or he developed, I guess, the skill of inhibition, which for me is absolutely core to the topic of the conversation we're going to have about non-fixation or unfixation. We can discuss which of those to go into as well. Where he was, I'm about to do the thing. I'm about to let my habit carry me off somewhere. And you can notice that moment where you're about to let your habit carry you off, pause and choose something different. And it was that pausing movement, the inhibiting movement, that is the core of his technique. And he kind of developed it from there. So as far as
Hmm.
I know, it was an independent derivation. He doesn't use any Eastern language. There's nothing about the Dharma in there. And it's kind of just one very empirically minded man kind of just did his thing for a long time and then came to London and taught his thing on his own. And he was quite litigious in a sense, like he was teaching his technique, right? He didn't really go off and
Yeah.
look at other stuff very much. He was like, this is my thing. So yeah.
There's not an Ashcroft technique coming down the pipeline. I hope, but we'll see.
It's funny. I did an April Fool's joke about rebranding Alexander technique as the Ashcroft method, and everyone's like, "Cool, yeah, we want this." I'm like, "No, no, 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 it was a joke." um,
um,
but I
yeah.
have been thinking about something along those lines because Alexander technique as a frame is interesting, but I want it to be like an input into wider stuff that I'm thinking about, not like just constrained by it. So it won't be the Ashcroft method because, dear God, no. But I might kind of say like, yeah,
But
one
I
thing
will
among
call it the
many.
Ashcroft method
I
to
I,
troll you.
I
Yeah,
suspect that you will. After
yeah.
this conversation, a few people will. Yeah.
Okay, one thing I want to do just to make sure that like we can kind of come to common terms
Mm,
as we get into this a little bit is just to make sure that I have a sense of the big pieces of Alexander technique as you teach it. So
mm,
I've looked at the course and I've read some stuff, and you and I have obviously talked about this, but I want to make sure I've got the sort of major components, or like what the different mental moves are
mm,
that you emphasize. So there's the expanding awareness gesture, which
mm-hmm.
is this noticing that awareness is not bounded on in any direction,
Yeah.
and that you can be, become contracted in a certain way where you lose sight of the fact that awareness
Mm,
extends infinitely in all directions, and you can by means of saying, could you be aware of a plane
mm,
flying overhead or
mm,
sounds to your left or right or whatever, notice that there's space in all those directions, and thereby sort of get out of this state of contractedness that you can trick yourself into being. So there's that gesture.
yeah.
There's the inhibition thing that you were speaking about, which the word is always sort of like bumped for me because it suggests almost the opposite of what it
Mm,
is, which is not putting a stop sign in front of something, but like what in a meditation context I would think of as like letting go of something, or like,
mm,
so not suppressing it, specifically not suppressing it,
yes.
but letting go of it, being aware of it in a wider context, allowing yourself to drop one thing and pick up something else,
Yeah.
as opposed to being sort of magnetized to it and
Mm,
grabbed by it and obligated by its apparent sort of implications.
yes. Just a
Um,
quick point on that, actually.
yeah,
The AT teachers often say, I haven't confirmed myself, that Alexander's use of the word predates Freud. So when you hear about inhibition, like he's inhibited, that's a Freudian use of, oh, he can't express something, he's like holding back, and kind of what I would say
mhm,
is fixated in a kind of way almost. Whereas
yeah,
Alexander's sense is more like inhibitory neurons, which is quite a nice parallel of like the thing that's just preventing something else from firing almost. It's a pause, wait mechanism, and when you can
yeah.
at some point release the weight, action happens ultimately.
Right, but in your phenomenology
Mm.
for it, that pausing
Mm-hmm.
is not like holding something at bay in the sense that it requires effort, or is it? I don't
It's
know.
non-effortful. It's non-effortful.
Yeah.
the way that, okay, so I try and explain this in the course, but I guess part of my journey in this is that Alexander technique teachers talk about inhibition and you learn to inhibit, but no one really digs into the phenomenology of what that's like from the inside. But my experience of that, because fortunately I've meditated a lot as well. I'm just fortunately quite aware of my inner landscape in that way, about awareness terms. And I've noticed that inhibition for me is a couple of different things. Often when I get, like, let's say triggered or I'm about to do something, yes, the awareness collapses and I can notice that. So I'm kind of like, I'm here on the thing. And there's a strange kind of spatial compression between me and the thing. So let's say I want to pick up a cookie, eat the cookie. I'll notice that it's almost like my brain is like compressing the space between me as the observer and the cookie. So it's like it's closer. I'm somehow tunneling vision into it. And that's always the felt sense. And inhibition is more akin to a mental move of allowing the distance to be there. Like, no, I'm certain that distance is what it actually is. I'm not distorting the distance. It's not the move of pushing the cookie away, if that makes sense.
Right.
It's just asserting that I'm not being pushed around by this thing, ultimately.
Right. Okay. And then another distinction that you draw that also obviously will be familiar to lots of meditators, especially meditators who have ever messed around with the Chuladasa mind illuminated system, is this attention awareness distinction. And attention has this like contractive character that you're talking about, and tends, when not sort of seen as occurring within a wider context, tends to have this sort of tunneling effect where your awareness collapses down to the size of the object that you're attending to, and it seems to have this sort of like gravitational pull on you. And you can, I remember you doing this in one of your, I think it was that early Stoa call that you did, where it's like, okay, you're about to go walk across the room and pick something up. Notice the quality of awareness of focusing on the thing that you're about to go pick up. And this sort of implication for like, you're about to act in a particular way on an object seems bound up with this quality of attention. Does that all line up with your,
So I kind of developed the ideas around the same thing that Culadasa says. So attention is the thing that moves around within awareness, ultimately. I know that different traditions use the word awareness as the pure, unchanging, always aware thing, as opposed to what Robert Bayer calls mind space, which is more like, I guess, this awareness and expansion and contraction thing. So there's a terminology thing going on. So I'm talking about the mind space, the contraction and expansion thing, as opposed to the witnesser, almost, which you could say is behind all of this. I guess the thing that is really important to draw out here is the I'm about to thing that Alexander technique points at. So I'm about to pick a thing up. I'm about to walk across the room. I'm about to, and then notice that as you're about to, I'm going to keep calling it awareness. Your awareness collapses. And you enter a kind of automatic autopilot, a program, subroutine kind of thing. And then once that's done, your awareness re-expands and you have choice again. This is what we kind of are poking at, basically.
Okay, cool. So there's I don't know if you know the philosopher Thomas Metzinger, who German philosopher, has written he's a meditator, and he's a sort of but he works in the analytic philosophy of mind, and he's written a few books about selflessness from a kind of analytic philosophy tradition, but he's got this idea of okay. So have you ever heard this term affordances from cognitive science?
Yes.
Okay, so for your listeners, an affordance is a way of perceiving something not as an object in itself, but as a potential action that you could take with respect to that object. So you perceive something directly as graspable, rather than perceiving a cup and then inferring that it's graspable. The graspability is sort of inherent in the perception, and this sort of affordance for action is prior to, it turns out, your ability to sort of represent objects at all. But Metzinger will talk about this with respect to the kind of cognitive affordance landscape of thoughts in meditation. So each thought that passes has this think me demand on it, basically, that's inviting you to follow it down some sort of train. And it does, and the way awareness collapses around thoughts, and then you get lost in thought in meditation, seems to have the same character, where it's like you perceive something that inherent in the perception from the vantage point of attention implies that you have to act on it in a particular way, And if you don't release that, you will helplessly act out whatever the imagined implication is of the perception. Does that
Yes,
jibe
that
with your sense
that
of things?
that that
Yeah.
fits. Yeah, because I talk about and teach spatial awareness as a way in, but I guess when I talk about expansion of awareness and contraction of awareness, I mean that in other kinds of space as well, like conceptual space, mind space, intellectual space, whatever you want to call it. You can get fixated on objects in the world, just as you can get fixated on thoughts and ideas and concepts and beliefs and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So the move of noticing that you're becoming caught up in this and then casting off almost, whether kind of all at once or specifically on a single thing that's caught you, I would associate that with Alexander's inhibition. And you can then go from there. One thing, a huge implication of this that I see is that and this is a new term we're going to introduce now, but fixation on something without inhibition decreases a sense of aliveness, which in my language basically means if you don't know that you could do something else, you're kind of stuck and you're diminished. You're on that autopilot routine. Whereas we did a lot of games with this in our training, where it's like, okay, walk across the room and pick up that ball on the floor in such a way as you could do anything else at any point. And you kind of realize that at a lot of points you're kind of like, oh no, I couldn't actually have done something else. I couldn't have stood up. I couldn't have left the ball. I was invested in picking up the ball. And there's this move where you can keep reasserting, like, I'm going to keep going to pick up the ball, and I could go and make a cup of coffee at the same time. And this openness is available to you, and that changes your entire biomechanical system. It changes your thoughts. It changes everything about how you experience the world. And it's that move of continually letting go of the need to complete the action that you're talking about. Like, oh, there's a ball, I must pick it up. The affordance of the ball is that I pick it up. You can really get the felt sense of what that's like when you play with it in the world like this.
Well, okay, so that's a third piece of, or fourth, I don't know where we're at here, of one thing I've noticed in how you teach Alexander technique is this agency sort of dimension of it, this increase in agency and the possibility of choice. And it's interesting to think about it, like, you could think about it in terms of like, okay, it's expanding the scope of your free will, but the kind of agency that you get from it is not like the doer kind of can make free choices. It's almost like freeing yourself for something else to come up. You know what I mean? Like
yes,
this is how it gets talked about in this video that I think I've shared with you before, this Francisco Varela video, where he's talking about this gesture of, he says, like, letting fixated mind become unfixed. And he's talking about it from the standpoint of being a Dzogchen practitioner, which is the sort of tradition of meditation that most interests me. But he's like, it's the eternal source of novelty and insight, and it's the sort of common gesture in spirituality and art and whatever else, is this ability to drop and put down so that something else can come up. And as you say, it's like, it's not limited to, well okay, so in meditation, when you're sitting still, you can see how the most dramatic version of that would be thoughts, right? So each thought that passes suggests some action, which is for you to get lost in thought because you're sitting still, your eyes are closed. But when you're out in the world, objects are sort of commanding your attention, and potential actions are grabbing your attention. And because you can act, because you're not sitting still, you can do that. But then even in like a sort of creative process, if you're trying to solve some problem, you can get caught in some rabbit hole where you've decided on particular constraints that you won't let yourself let go of, because if you feel like if you do let go of them, then you've lost whatever progress. But having, like, getting the next creative insight will always be a matter of being able to put that down and not make something else come up, but like let something else come up. And the kind of agency that you get is not, it's like a freedom, but it's not a freedom as a solitary agent or something like that. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Yes, I do. And it's funny because I know that various people talk about the absence of free will that just doesn't exist. And I haven't dug into literature on that deeply, but there's something to me like it feels like it exists. And that seems important for some reason. Like the fact that I can feel like there's more freedom to do things as a felt sense seems important. And the way that manifests itself, let's say in the way I trained, someone throws a ball at you, and you can fixate on, oh, there's a ball coming to me, I have the affordance of I have to catch the ball. You can do that casting off the notions move while still intending to catch the ball, and then your arm moves itself as perceived by you. So there is a strange interplay of you're not grasping or controlling or forcing your intention on the world, but you do still have one, and then your system responds differently to that kind of unfixated intention as opposed to the fixated intention, almost.
Yeah. The voice from the no free will camp would say, and I genuinely like, I don't want to get into the rabbit hole of free will versus no free will, but the sort of it's also true to say that attention and intentions. So it's definitely true that intentions precede actions in interesting ways. Even these sort of apparently involuntary actions, like you say, of catching the ball, you have the intention, and then your system spontaneously organizes around doing it. Phenomenologically, though, intentions also just
Arise.
appear
Yeah.
from the void, right? And then the question becomes like, okay, like what what does freedom mean in that context? And it is this ability to sort of like be available for new
Yes.
intentions to arise or something like that.
Well, this is interesting where it gets into more spiritual views, I guess, of what is the thing that causes certain intentions to arise and not others, almost. So let's say that I were completely, perfectly unfixated and allowing all of these intentions. Would I be, in some sense, opening up a channel to something that's expressing itself through me that isn't, in fact, me? I mean, it's kind of more in the direction of Hindu cosmology at that point. But it is interesting if it is the case that there is no free will, but there is an extent to which I can allow more of this other thing to express itself or not, or interfere with it, then there's just something funny about that, I think. There's a felt sense of that anyway.
Well, so the reason why I don't think the no free will thing is a pessimistic conclusion, it's like it's pessimistic if you take it from the standpoint of I really am this separate thing.
Yes.
And now I'm going to get pushed around by the universe as this separate thing.
Yeah.
And stay separate but be pushed around.
Yeah.
And really it's about you not actually being fundamentally separate. You're not one with, like, you're not, it's not a sort of homogenous goo, but you're not really separate in the end either. And so you're like sort of open to the sources of the universe that but they also work through you. It's not like a sort of, it's non-dual as the jargon would go.
Indeed. So I guess it's almost like no free will in a way that feels
I've
bad.
tricked you into talking about non-duality and Alexander technique.
Well, I'm
as
very
was always
interested
my goal.
in this stuff. It's funny when I see you tweet stuff like, Michael won't say this, but he's teaching literal enlightenment. I'm like, no, I'm not. I'm not going to go there. But it's there's all skills on the way, I would say. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So maybe it would be helpful for me to say something about like what I see the sort of meditative project as being, and then we can compare and contrast. So I don't know sort of how much familiarity people have with different systems, but in a sort of Buddhist context, there are a lot of different things you can go into. But okay, so it's helpful to distinguish two sort of broad paths. One coming out of Theravada, which is a sort of oldest tradition in Buddhism, and another coming out of Vajrayana, which is sort of third turning of the wheel, newer Buddhism. But okay, so in Theravada you might do something called vipassana, which is the Pali word for insight practice. And there the logic is that you might start with something like paying attention to the breath as a kind of object of concentration. Every time you get lost, you come back to the breath, and you're attending in this sort of attention sense that we were talking about earlier, as opposed to just merely being aware. There's something effortful about it. There's something directed about it. Good concentrations and instructions will tell you not to lose sight of this background context of awareness, even as you pay close attention, because if you do, it can become very brittle and contracted and unpleasant. So ideally you would sort of keep awareness in view, but you're still concentrating. And then the sort of logic of Vipassana is that you build up a certain amount of concentration, then you can notice certain characteristics of experience that the clear seeing of which is liberative, because it undermines certain delusions that you have in your ordinary way of perceiving things. So the three characteristics are impermanence, unsatisfactoriness or suffering, and not self. That nothing is you, and nothing has independent, separate existence. And the reason why this is liberative is because the claim is that your ordinary experience of suffering is predicated on a kind of reification that you do of ordinary experience and of yourself within it, so that you reify objects as fixed and solid and permanent and separate, and yourself as some permanent, enduring, solid, separate thing. and that reification is the sort of source of suffering. And then seeing that that isn't actually the case of experience can break that inference pattern and free the mind of suffering. I'm distorting it a little bit because in a traditional Buddhist context, it would be involved with this whole thing of getting out of the world. But okay, so that's the Vipassana logic. And then in non-dual traditions, and specifically in Dzogchen, which is the one that sort of interests me most, the claim is a little bit different, which is that awareness itself, the nature of mind, is already totally free of the sense of being a self and of any of these sort of diluted qualities. And then the practice consists in being able to notice that, and then extending the moments in which you can notice that. And the sort of way the nature of mind gets described in the Dzogchen context would be the inseparability of emptiness and form, which are sort of like jargon terms. But emptiness you can think of as what awareness is like prior to any conceptualization. So like prior to this sort of overlay of reified concepts on it, what is awareness like? And it's this sort of holographic, translucent character where nothing is really solid and it all has the quality of a kind of projection, or like nothing's really happening, even though, and this is the other side of it, form, there's still this display of appearances with all its, you can still make all the sort of conceptual distinctions you could make before, you can still see all the variety in your perceptual field, but it's fundamentally empty. And so therefore like ungraspable, and there's nothing that you could there's nothing that could in principle sort of bind you. Okay, so I don't know if that will probably, as you say, that uses lots of like Buddhist jargon and a very sort of Buddhist framing, but I'm curious how intelligible that is to you, and then we can talk maybe about how it relates to what you're teaching.
I think it's pretty intelligible. A lot of those experiences I can't quite conceptualize. The idea of the world being holographic and not quite there is not one I've had. But there is something you've tweeted at some point 4 different book covers that point at, one of them was like roaring silence or something like that. And the use of the word void always intrigues me. And again, the Robert Bayer book talks about this. It's not an emptiness in the sense of nihilistic nothingness. It's, and my experience is close to this when it's happened, is like, wow, this is very bright and big and a lot.
Vastness.
Vast, huge, like alive, like emptiness. And I don't get the word in that context, but I'd love it if you could talk a little bit around why do some traditions, it sounds in particular Dzogchen talks about the roaring silence version of the void, as opposed to maybe the Theravadins going like void or just emptiness, and kind of not making that distinction almost.
Okay, so I don't want to offend any partisans of a particular tradition by okay, just in general, to give people a sense of what the landscape looks like here. So from the perspective of Dzogchen, the sort of history of Buddhist practices would be categorized in terms of Sutra, Tantra, and Dzogchen. Sutra being the ones associated with Vipassana and Theravada. And those are understood as having the goal of arriving at insight into emptiness. Now, in a traditional Buddhist context, that would have meant, okay, so you've got this holdover Hindu frame of the wheel of samsara that you're bound to, and you don't want to get reborn, and so you want to get off the wheel of samsara into nirvana, which means getting out of the world, which means no longer being reborn. And this sort of deconstructive project that you're engaged in something like Vipassana is understood to be a matter of getting you out of the world in some important sense, like no longer bound to the wheel of samsara. And emptiness is like this sort of understood in that context as being the fabricated nature of all experience. And if you're reading Robert Bayer, we just got in a debate about this, not you and I, but me and other people, not really a debate, we all agreed in the end, but a discussion about this on Twitter today. Burbea teaches this from a very Theravada point of view, which is that he talks about fabrication, and suffering and fabrication just go together. Like that if there is experience, there is suffering. Mm-hmm. And they sort of, and you want to fabricate less and less and less, or more and more skillfully, but fabrication and experience are one thing. Like insofar as you're producing experience, you're fabricating on the sort of Burbea understanding. And you can have this sort of overlay type fabrication of like over reification, but
Mm.
experience is fabrication, and that's suffering. And uh, that's not the understand, or at least so on the Vajrayana or Dzogchen understanding, the problem is not fabrication or that there is experience. The problem is just reification. And when when you can be aware of the empty quality of experience and not lose sight of that, while in a sort of uninhibited way allowing form to arise. So another way that awareness will get described in Dzogchen is the union of emptiness and clarity,
Mm.
or another word for clarity would be luminosity, which is this character of spontaneous reflexive knowing that awareness has. It just instantaneously knows everything the moment it arises. It couldn't not know it. You'll give an instruction like this where it's like, try to stop being aware of something, or notice that like you don't have to do anything to be aware of everything that you're aware of. This is just what awareness is like. It's like there's no effort associated with its ability to know things. If you can keep the emptiness part in view and let things spontaneously arise without inhibition, experience doesn't have to go away. That's perfectly free. And so the difference in views, and this is not to say it's a difference how everybody will teach it, will just be, okay, do you have to get out of the world and get rid of experience, or is freedom perfectly available in the midst of ordinary experience? And okay, probably more than you bargained for, but that's
No,
that
no,
answer your question?
it's really interesting. The thing that was coming up in me when you were saying all that was, so I'm thinking the Alexander technique stuff is closer to the tantric almost. It's not the leave the world model. It's be more in the world, ultimately.
Yeah.
And the way I frame it, or the way I experience it, is it's like I keep catching myself involved in kind of doings. Whether I'm doing holding my shoulder, whether I'm doing worrying, whether I'm doing something, which sounds like a reification almost. It's a fixation on a concept. I at one point found myself with a very strange experience where I caught myself doing the world almost. I was stood there in a room kind of like, hang on, there's this background process. That's a bird. There was a background process of doing the world, and if I don't
you could
do
be
this,
aware of it. You could
and
be
I could
aware
be,
of it.
I was aware of myself doing the world, and I was like,
Oh, I
why?
meant the bird. I'm sorry. Yeah.
Oh yeah. Sorry, no.
I was saying there was a bird, and you could be aware of it. Yeah.
Yeah. It was. Yeah, I was able to notice it. But yeah, I think I realized that I hadn't noticed this before, and I was worried about what would happen if I stopped. Like, I need to be doing the world in order for it to exist. But then I was like, hang on, I have a move for this. I can inhibit my doing of the world. And the more that I turned down my doing of the world, the brighter things got. The more like vivid and flowy and like, holy crap, look at all this. Wow. Sensation came up. So yeah, direct experience of what you're pointing at, I think.
Yeah. Okay. So to your earlier question about why are all these books called Roaring Silence and things of that nature, right? Okay. So one way of describing not doing the world is de-reifying your perception of the world. So this goes in the direction of what I was talking about as its sort of like holographic character of Shinzen will talk about like feather light and paper thin. It's like it becomes a little bit less solid but brighter, more vivid, more and you think that you have to hold on to it to make it to know it, but that's exactly what dims it, collapses it, makes it stale. And we're pointing at very similar phenomenology, and tantra very much. Okay, so to just orient people a little bit, so sutra will take you from reified form to emptiness is the sort of logic, recognition of emptiness. Tantra starts from the base of emptiness, and then is about the vivid display of appearance from that recognition, like how form appears when you sort of got this recognition of emptiness, which is this insanely vivid, like flaming on, like it can get really dramatic, but not a problem in the same way it seems to be when you're reifying even negative experience, even like painful emotion. If you can see its emptiness, it can become this really vivid thing. Michael Taft, who's my meditation teacher, has a meditation on his YouTube channel called the Tantric Fearlessness Challenge, where he'll just take you through negative emotions. Like he's like, not bring up all your shame, but then like has you see the emptiness of it, and you come out of that, and it's like somebody just turned up the lumens on experience like 20%, because all this energy is bound up in in not trying not to feel certain things.
Yeah.
And anyway, so
No, it's fascinating. I've got a couple of points, but one is I just did a tantra weekend, training weekend, ending day before yesterday. And it's like, that was a lot, basically, of, okay, the core message being what you resist persists, basically. So let's just feel all of that suffering. Like, oh God, I don't want to. But actually, the way they framed it of, okay, bring up the divine masculine energy to contain the emotions, and then just look at them and experience them. You can hold both, and then they just transform. And if you stop fighting it, it all changes. Which is again similar to AT in my sense of, if you just see that you're sustaining it, you can almost just put it down. You then feel it because you're not fighting it, but then it just leaves at the same time, which I find so counterintuitive for my old sense. The old version of who I was like, no, I have to like push around my feelings. And the more I do this kind of stuff, the more I'm like, I can just be a channel for them, and then they do a thing and they leave.
Let them flow through.
Yeah, exactly.
So I want to just take what you just said and put it in the okay. So you're saying at this tantra weekend, they had you bring up divine masculine energy to cope with the suffering that they were also having you bring up.
It wasn't as much to cope; it was to create a safety, like almost like the father figure, be like, it is safe here for you to express and feel whatever feminine energy or the emotional side. And the masculine is like containing. And actually, when they said please embody the divine masculine, it went straight into the AT mode for me. Just like full awareness, expansion, full like presence. It was the same energy. I was like, holy crap! Okay, this is the same.
Okay. So this is what I wanted to bring it up is the reason why the sequence is Sutra, Tantra, Dzogchen is that. So in Tantra, into traditional Vajrayana Tibetan Tantra, you're doing all these like deity yoga visualizations where you're visualizing this giant deity from the tradition that has all these qualities of awareness that like this sort of like power and all and wisdom and whatever else. So you summon the sort of visualization of that. You sort of like swap identities with that thing that you've just like visualized, and then you let it dissolve. But then that, what does it dissolve into? An awareness that already has all the qualities that you just like summoned in the form of the deity, and then it's like empowering you to just drop in to the awareness that already has that. And this, it seems like it just struck you that this is the case already, right? It's like you do the thing that you have to effortfully bring up, only to have it enable you noticing that it's already true of awareness in some sense.
Yeah, exactly. And I was pretty astonished by how like embodying Shiva, for example, was just like, apparently I know how to do this. I know very little about Shiva, and I'm like, fine, cool, this makes sense.
Totally. I do want to hear a little bit more about that, because I'm not sure I could effortlessly embody Shiva. So what did that mean, and why was it so easy?
I guess it was in the context of a series of steps, but the idea of Shiva being the archetypal masculine figure, that energy of holding, creating space, safety, of the energy of we got this, ultimately. And for me, that is kind of, it felt the same as I am untroubled by things, ultimately.
Yeah.
So in the sense of, so I actually did this morning, part of my new practice is I created a masculine holding space where there was that sense of we got this, and then this feminine emotional body thing was able to like move and transform and like do its thing. But I think there's an interplay there of the masculine remaining unfixated on any of the content of the feminine energy, of that emotion energy, right? So it's like, you're bringing up this thing that happened when I was a kid. You're bringing up this like argument I had, and I'm not getting attached to it. I can let it go, and like that's that interplay almost.
There's a great expression from one of these. It's from some version of the story of the Buddha, and sitting beneath the Bodhi tree on the night of his enlightenment or whatever. But one of the sort of mythological versions of it has this line where he says, "And the mind of the great being was unmoved." And so it's like all these things keep coming up, and it's like it keeps coming back to like, "And the mind of the great being was unmoved." And I've often like used that as like a practice, and it is like, okay, all this shit is coming up, not in the sense of like not having a sort of mushy heart to it. It's a very tricky balance, right? Because you don't want to like the mind of the great being is unmoved, therefore I'm not going to feel these soft lame feelings or something like that. Like that's a failure mode. It is much more this you are the spacious context in which
Mm.
that stuff is totally permitted to arise, but that's never sort of tainted or damaged by it or stained by it or something
Mm.
like that. Yeah.
And it was astonishing to me in the tantric frame, at least in the weekend that I did, was to the extent that you can feel that stuff when it comes up and still remain unmoved. Like you could be sat there like screaming and yelling and like howling and all kinds of things, just like sobbing and remain unmoved, right? It
Yeah.
doesn't expressing and feeling all that stuff doesn't mean that you're like involved in it, but it's just like it's definitely there. And
Yeah.
I find the more I do that kind of thing, the more I'm tapping into it, the more I leave that practice with more aliveness, with more sense of there's just more available of me somehow. More can flow through me, and I remain unmoved.
Yeah.
So now I'm
And
wondering,
perception is more vivid, and
yes,
there are all these. Yeah, it's amazing.
exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. There's something you said earlier that I want to kind of touch on around. It's like a paper thin. What's the expression? Like a paper thin or a.
Feather light and paper thin, which is a Shinzen Young expression. Yeah.
So can you just say more about what that means? And I think I have a thing to relate that to, but I want to be clear on what he means by that.
Yeah. Okay. So I should say this is not like I vaguely know what he means here,
Mm.
and to some extent from my own experience, but the context it comes from is a podcast that he did with Michael Taft, where he's talking about his experience as somebody far further along on the path than I am. So I don't mean, or I should say, I don't have a reference point in my experience for exactly what he means by it in its full expression. But okay, so when you can, so he's coming out of to some extent, the way he teaches is very Theravada informed Vipassana type practice. And so, for example, there's a practice that you can do there called Just Note Gone, which is you train yourself to be aware of the moment when a sensation that's arisen goes away and
Mm.
disappears. And you'll very quickly notice if you try to do this practice, it's very hard to keep that in view because we tend to notice things that pop up and then have moved on to something else by the time it goes away. So we never actually notice how fast things are changing and disappearing. But we also, you'll find yourself not wanting to let it disappear. Like there's
Yes.
this subtle, like, don't let it go away.
Mm.
And then we're surprised why, okay, like, when an emotion like anger shows up, it just seems to persist and persist and persist.
Mm.
We're doing that. We're sort of keeping it going in some sense. But when you de-reify experience a lot and stop doing that thing where you impute it a sort of solidity and permanence that it doesn't have and keep it going and sort of buy into experience, then, as you say, it's just like arising and passing without any sort of reification.
Mm.
And when it arises, it's not really separable from this translucency of awareness either. It's
Mm.
sort of arising as a modification of awareness, and it's disappearing, and everything. And the more sort of fine-grained sensory clarity you get of it too, you're seeing it almost like a mist level. It's just flowing and disappearing and flowing and disappearing and flowing,
Yeah.
and never has any kind of real solidity to it. And so that's the sort of perceptual description of it. But a crucial piece of it is that, like, the experience of sort of thickness of the world and of
Mm.
your experience is also the experience of like suffering.
Yes.
It's like, it's also the experience of like the world is heavy and like it's a burden and like I'm just like life is tough and all of that. So the feather light and paper thinness is also like just less and less suffering, less and
Mm.
less of a burdensome world is one way of thinking about it.
This is really interesting because I'm thinking about the Adesanya technique frame basically, which again has none of these concepts from Buddhism in it, and yet the way that we work is that you can guide someone into this state through touch. So you'll put your hands on their back, on their neck, and their head, and that kind of thing, and then within, depending on how trained someone is to receive it, it's like within 30 seconds or within half an hour lesson if it's the first time or something, you're in this state of the world, like the world is lighter, easier, brighter, just more free. All these words come up, and then the journey of watching someone grapple with this is always fascinating, because when they're like new to it, they have this experience going like, "Holy crap! I can have this," and then
And then it's like, why was I holding all of that for
why
so
was I
long?
exactly what and then what was I doing? And then you start playing with the part of the mind that needs to make sense of these things getting like fixated and it gets in the way. So the main thing to give a new student like is don't try to get back into this state, because the harder you try to get back into the state, the more it'll not be here. And you have to learn like wh- we had this interesting journey with the trainees. So I went through training school, and most of my experience actually is going back to the school and helping other teacher trainees like practice their skills. Basically, I don't have my own practice, and
Mm.
it's fascinating to watch. Like every week, every month of training, and I did the same thing. You have a new conception of what AT is. Like I know what it is this month. It's I have to be aware of the space. Oh no, it isn't. I have to be able to do something else. I have to have that, whatever it is. And like every month there's a new one, and it works briefly, and then it stops working because you
Yeah.
switch from the actual move, which you haven't quite grasped yet, to the doing the thing you think it is. And
Yeah.
the definition of AT I now give to like the students when they're more advanced is Alexander technique is the skill of letting go of what you thought it was
Yeah.
repeatedly, ultimately. And then you're on that tightrope.
Beautiful coinage. Yeah. 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 Yeah.
It
That's
just
great.
sounds like very similar to what you're saying of like you have to catch the process of doing the thing that you're aiming for that isn't the thing, and it's wonderfully loopy and weird, but eventually you can just like learn the global move and go like just assert the move as opposed to like trying to assert the move, and that's it. A world of difference between those two things.
Yeah. Well, and okay, so let me try to translate that into some meditation-y type language, but also
Mm-hmm.
point to what I think is so exciting about it. So, okay, so if I'm hearing you correctly, there's this phenomenon where there are different gestures of attention or awareness that you can learn in an Alexander technique context, which you then turn into something to do to get back to the state that it got you into when you
Mm-hmm.
initially learned it. And eventually any given technique that you give somebody will turn into something that they're trying to do and
Yeah.
thereby cease to work because the fundamental gesture is not doing and letting it go.
Yeah.
Okay, so this is definitely like of a piece, as I'm sure you suspect with meditation stuff. It's also of a piece with what we were talking about earlier of like what is that source that's actually like Varela will talk about the eternal source of novelty. What is the actual source of aliveness in
Yeah.
experience? Like from where does it come? And I think it's the same process in this process by which any given technique or gesture or doing that you learn and then you try to push the sacredness button or like push the aliveness button with is the very thing
Mm.
that closes down that experience of aliveness. So the way that this would relate to some sort of the deeper end of the pool insights in Buddhism is around not self is like in constructing a doer,
Mm.
or it's not even really that you construct it. It's like you trick yourself into thinking you are a doer in some very
Yeah.
bizarre sense.
Okay.
But in constructing that sense of a doer, you are closing like you were never the source of that thing, and you want to be the source of thing. You want a certain kind of control, and that isn't available to you. And in trying to get that kind of control or tricking yourself into thinking you have that kind of control, you lose sight of the very thing that you're after. And the thing that keeps you doing that, you could think about in terms of like fear of emptiness.
Mm.
So like there are two responses that you could have if you do this sort of like drop into the vastest possible context of awareness, right? One is like, oh my god, it's super vast, what a burden is lifted. But the other that's much more common, if you just tell somebody who's untrained, okay, just let go, abandon all reference points,
Mm.
and just rest as the vast spaciousness of awareness, they might be able to do that for a second,
Mm.
and then immediately it's like this fear of open spaces thing will
Yeah.
come in. It's like they will collapse back down again because it's just like too vast.
Mm.
And a lot of what's going on and why it gets framed in terms of form and emptiness is you have to like you fooled yourself into thinking that emptiness is the threat, when in fact it's this losing sight of emptiness that keeps that dulls experience and that keeps you
Mm.
bound. And it's like perfectly flip your sense of what's the source of your suffering or something like that.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
And it's funny that you mentioned that because my teacher. So I said that you can give someone this experience of, I don't want to call it emptiness, but the more of the more in the direction of the roaring void stuff through touch, right?
Like I like openness and I like
Yeah,
vastness because emptiness seems to have this nihilistic character,
I think so.
and openness and vastness both like there's a great line from Douglas Harding where he says a vast emptiness vastly filled. So
Yes.
it's like,
Yes.
and both of
Yes.
those are true.
Exactly. Okay. So let's use the word. I'm gonna use the word vastness for now because that's more like what it
Okay.
feels like. So
Yeah.
the weird thing about ET is that you can give someone the vastness experience through touch, and incidentally, I call it Dementor mode. You can also like fixate them and like decrease their vastness very easily by like doing the opposite move, which is a good contrasting tool, but it's uncomfortable. My teacher, when he teaches, he says he looks at someone and like he has a sense of how much can they handle, almost like how much
Mm.
vastness is someone able to tolerate, and he'll like, you're not giving you all of it. Like you aren't ready for all of that vastness yet. You're going to stay down here, and then incrementally we're going to take you up to the more vastness, because it would be too much to deal with to begin with. So
Yeah.
the fact that I think some people do start to suddenly have this insight of like, wow, this is a lot, and a lot is often too much, and you kind of habitually come down.
Yeah.
I want to link all of this, and I'm opening an enormous like tangent here, but I want to bring in the McGilchrist model of how brains work a little bit into all of this.
Yes.
Because, and for those, okay, I'll give a little bit of
And how Alexander technique will cure the ills of the Western world, I hope.
I mean, yes, or at least
I mean, I'm not saying that. Yeah.
Yeah, I know you're not. How the entire conversation we're having will play a role in that undoing of difficulty. Yeah. So
Mm-hmm.
for those who aren't aware, Ian McGilchrist is a neurologist, and he wrote two books. Both are enormous, weighty tomes. One called The Master and His Emissary, the other called The Matter of Things. And the basic premise is that the brain is split into.
I've got it right there, but I was going to turn it. Yeah. I don't want to mess with my camera. Yeah.
It's something like 2,000 pages is the matter of things. It's insane. The model is that you have two brain hemispheres, and the first thing to say is that everything you think you know about hemispheres is probably wrong, according to McGilchrist. It's not like one side does creativity, one side does words. It's more complicated than that. The main difference is that the left hemisphere does attention, and it relates to the world through attention. The right hemisphere relates to the world through awareness. So some characteristics being left hemisphere is doing, grasping, manipulating, isolates things from their environment, freezes passage of time, sees objects around as tools. Whereas the right hemisphere is broadly, openly aware. It sees relationships. It sees the passage of time. It remains unfixated, I think, in this frame. The core issue being that the right hemisphere is the one really running the show, in a sense. It's like things enter via the right hemisphere. Yeah, ought to be. But the left hemisphere doesn't know this, ultimately. So it tries to do all the things that the right hemisphere should be doing, and it gets in the way. It doesn't do things so well. So in the analogy of catching a ball, for example, the left hemisphere doesn't know how to move the body particularly well, but it tries to, and you get these awkward, janky, like just not very smooth movements. The trick required is for the left hemisphere to shut the hell up a lot of the time, and get the right hemisphere to do it. The issue there being the left hemisphere doesn't know about this dynamic, and the move it's looking for is to turn itself off or to step away. But none of the things it does are that. It just tries another layer of doing something else when the move is step aside. And what we're pointing out, we think, at least what I think was going on, is learning the move associated with cessation, with stop interfering, with like, not me right now, left hemisphere, allowing something else, right hemisphere, which might be the connection to source that Jake is pointing to. And if our brains are structured in such a way that reflects all of this, I find that quite interesting.
Yeah. Well, I definitely I'm also compelled by McGilchrist in the way that you are, but I should say for any skeptical listener, even if you don't care, like even just throw the two hemispheres, like the neuroanatomy component of the argument aside, and just inspect phenomenologically whether the things he's saying about attention and awareness are true, and you can get 90% of the value, I would say, from the books, and that's because it's definitely true of attention and awareness, whether or not those map on in any clean way to the hemispheres. But also, it would be very interesting if they did.
It was interesting seeing, I won't name names, but someone on Twitter who's quite well known calling it all neurobollocks. And I'm going like, I feel somewhat triggered by this, and yet I also don't care, because the insights that emerge from it still seem useful and true. If it's not literally,
and if you'll recall my reply to that tweet, I went into this distinction that we were talking about before, and then it was no longer quite as objectionable. But okay, so one thing that I want to bring up in this context is, and maybe this will come back to non-fixation versus unfixation. So, and this goes to also at least to my ear, this instruction to expand awareness versus, so obviously it's very clear that many of the same things are being noticed when I'm talking about, non-dual practices and different kinds of meditation practices that are especially sort of spacious and Alexander technique. But one crucial distinction that I feel like I detect, and maybe it's not quite true, I don't think it's true in your experience, but it's definitely true in how AT sometimes gets taught, is awareness always already like this? Or is it one of multiple moves available to you to expand versus contract awareness? So like when you talk about attention as being in a context of awareness, well then that has this implication that awareness is there always, and attention is something happening within it that you can mistake for the whole show in some sense. So there's this implication that awareness is already there. But part of what makes the sort of Dzogchen frame on these things liberative is that it's specifically, so the sort of traditional aim in Buddhism is happiness independent of conditions. It's like the non-conditionality of it is key, and the way you get non-conditionality in Dzogchen is that it's already true of awareness all the time, including right now, and if you could just notice it.
Yeah.
And rather than it being the case that it's something that you have to do, and all of the apparent, contractedness and suffering and lack of agency and whatever else, that's the doing. That's the added thing, where the awareness has none of that.
Yes.
Associated with it. Anyway, I'll just have you react to that.
It's interesting. I guess I should first of all say to anyone curious about going for AT lessons is that most teachers won't talk about awareness in these terms. My teacher describes our lineage, or how his frame, as the anarcho left wing of the Alexander technique world. So if you go to have lessons after this conversation, you might have to do some translation of what the experience is like.
Don't ask your Alexander technique teacher about Dzogchen and expect them.
Indeed not. And Jake, I think you're getting a bit blurry. I think your camera wants to focus on your microphone. So if there's I don't know if there's a way that you can yeah, there we go. Perfect.
All right. Sorry.
No, that's okay. So translating what you said, I think, into my experience, AT doesn't talk about like different layers of awareness, but there's definitely like a strong attention that can get fixated. There's awareness that can collapse. And there's something that can recognize that awareness is collapsed, right? It's possible to wake up out of that state, and that's what you're learning, right? So there's the thing that's always aware, in a sense, that gets obscured by this like fixation, strong attention, a collapse of spatial awareness, let's call it, or whatever else awareness, what Bebea calls mind space, I think. And then you can kind of learn to like keep stepping out of that, or like, I think a lot of the time it's spontaneous, honestly. The reason that having a teacher in front of you is so helpful is that it's very clear when someone has gone off, and you can kind of catch them while they're there, rather than waiting for their own spontaneous coming back to awareness, which they probably won't recognize until they've been taught a few things. So it's a very surreal experience to be in a lesson, looking face to face with the teacher, doing awareness stuff, and then for a split second you go off somewhere, like you're no longer in the room, you're no longer aware, and the teacher goes, "Where were you? Come back." And you go, "You're right, I was somewhere, but I cannot tell you what was going on. I was just..." And you have this like weird like rush, weird like kind of being dragged back into reality kind of sensation, almost like kind of head spinning experience. And you're like, cool, okay, now I have a sense of what that was. And the more of that goes on, the more you can kind of catch, like you can catch when you're in it more and more. I think it might be some kind of habitual, the way I describe it is you're training. What you should do in AT style is like always be like practicing the ping of the world. Like, am I aware? Am I aware? Am I here? Am I here? All that kind of stuff. And I think the more you do that, the more you're kind of training part of your mind to keep doing that in the background almost, so that you're less likely to go off. But I still go off, and then I come back and I go, ha ha ha, look at that. Isn't that funny?
Yeah. Well, and there can also be this thing, people talk about this in meditation, I'm sure it's true of AT too, of the contraction can become a kind of alarm to set that ping off, so it's like, if you feel yourself like I can't like really drill down on my phone and stare at Twitter without something going, hold on a minute, like like you're in this position and you're like, it's just the tighter the contraction gets, the more likely the alarm is to get triggered, and then something
Yeah,
wakes you up from it.
exactly.
Um,
And you start to get these more clues, because yeah, your body reacts differently when you get fixated on Twitter. You realize that you're doing this, and you're like, hang on, why am I doing that? Why is there like a generalized pattern of tension in my body? Why is my neck doing a different thing? Why am I breathing differently? And that gives you a clue. And this is a key principle in Alexander technique of psychophysical unity, where mind and body are one process. It's not that mind and body are same parts of this of one. It's just that it's one thing. It's not like they go together. They're one thing. So I think this is why the hands-on approach works to change your awareness, your mind state, because you can just go in via the body rather than directly going in mind to mind, if you like, or at one end of the process.
Yeah. Okay, so one other implication of the it's always already there claim about awareness, though, is that it's actually so expanding awareness suggests like there are boundaries, but you're making them further out in some sense.
Yes.
And the always already there claim alongside the emptiness claim is that the boundaries are just a concept. So in some important sense, it's boundless, like really boundless. Like and that doesn't mean that you're omniscient in some sense, like that you can, like hear the plane on the other side of the world. It's that whatever phenomenological boundary seems to be appearing, however expansive it is an appearance and is empty and is therefore doesn't bind awareness.
Yeah.
And then the bizarre thing is that you can say this in all sorts of different dimensions. So boundless, timeless. There's a sense in which the sense of the passage of time is another sort of conceptual overlay. And it's not that it's timeless in the sense of it becoming infinite time. It's like conceptually prior to time in some strange sense. And then stillness, the same thing. So like prior to motion in some sense, boundless, timeless, stillness. There are other ones, but you get the idea that like you can move in the direction of these. It's the same principle as the deity yoga in some sense, right? You can move in the directions of these things by summoning them as constructions, like make your awareness really, really wide, and then you can just note, oh, I could just let go of that, and then rest in it's already as wide as it could possibly be. Yeah.
The way that so my teacher did this when I was training was, you can make kind of incrementally expand that the interim awareness thing, the thing that can expand and contract. So like expand to the end of the road, expand to the end of the city, and it's not like you're imagining these things. It's just like you're remembering that these spaces exist. Ultimately, it's reoccurring to you that, oh yeah, that exists, and you can push that, like planet, solar system, like you can kind of have that move a long way out, and then you can start saying, well, just make that boundary a bit blurry. Make that boundary porous almost. Just like let go of, make the edges fuzzy, and then you enter into this just like vastness, the thing that you're describing a little bit. No time, no like just stillness, all of these things. And I had an experience early on in my training, which I still to this day cannot explain what happened. I have not had it since. But I was working with another trainee who is now a shaman. I'm not sure if that's relevant to the story. Might be. But I was working with three concepts at once. I was working with the on having no head model from Douglas Harding. So the idea of...
Go ahead. Yeah,
we can talk about. Let me just tell.
I just want to make sure that people know what the hell it is and how it relates to what we're talking about. But go ahead.
Okay,
go ahead.
We'll loop back on that because it is interesting, and I use it in the course. So this thing, which we'll talk about, I was expanding awareness as far as I could go, and then making the edges porous. And I had my hand on another trainee's back. So we were doing the in contact thing that AT involves. And suddenly...
sorry, the edges porous. I want to make sure that I'm following the full sequence here. Okay, so you were doing on having no head just in general.
Yeah. Layered with at the same
time. In that
time,
moment, you were noticing the edges of awareness were porous.
Yeah, so huge, vast size of awareness, and then the edges became porous. So those moves all at once. And I was in contact with someone else kind of doing a similar thing at the same time. And suddenly there was this like moment of like just vastness, I guess, but it came with this enormous like physical rush. Like I went bright red, everything was tingling, I was blissed out, I had to go and lie down for like an hour and fell asleep on the floor. And just this like enormous confluence of like insight almost. And the weirdest thing was, and it's what I still can't explain. The person I had my hand on had the same experience, and she was like, "Whoa, what is going on?" And just for anyone watching, like, physics degree, I believe in like how things, like, I believe in empiricism and whatever, but like, I have no idea what happened that day. Hasn't
Yeah.
happened since, but it gave me an insight into like there's a lot more that's transmissible here via whatever mechanism, and a lot more that we can access by mere awareness than we think. And
Well,
that
and
was like,
you're not fundamentally separate, right? Like
mm,
it's actually the more, I mean, obviously there, you know, you don't want to get into sort of real woo of like spooky action at a distance,
indeed,
but uh, I think the more physics friendly view of what it is to be a person is a porous one rather
mm,
than a kind of I'm so fully, you know, a skin encapsulated ego that there couldn't be any interchange between me and another person. You know what I mean? Like
yeah.
it's yeah. I think the non separateness is on sounder ground physically. But yeah, that sounds like an amazing experience.
It was wild. And the funniest thing was my teacher just said, "Oh, we had a power surge," and we never spoke of it again. I was like, okay, well, that was like one of the most profound experiences of my life. And I was like, yeah, don't worry about it.
I'm curious because you said it was attended by a bunch of insights. So can do any of those insights? Could you
Mm.
recall any of them? I'm assuming they were mostly sort of not exactly conceptual, but what do you mean?
Non-conceptual, but just one of like time stopped, but not in the sense of it was infinitely long. It was just like you were saying, there was like the precondition before time. It's like time didn't
Yeah.
make sense in that moment. It was just like the word infinite is wrong here, because I was aware of time
You,
passing, but
okay.
it was also a sense of vast vastness in time sense rather than just in spatial or vividness sense almost.
Yeah. So timeless, not in the sense of you couldn't trust. So this is the key sort of character of Rigpa, which is a sort of center of the bullseye
Mm,
non-dual awareness in a Dzogchen context, is that you don't actually lose the concepts. You
mm,
don't lose the ability to sort of orient in space. You don't lose the sense, I mean, kind of, but you don't really lose the sense of the passage of time either. It's not
mm,
you like it's not like an LSD trip where a minute feels like an hour in some
yeah,
sense. It's that you're not bound by those concepts in the
mm,
same way. Like whatever awareness is, it's prior to that, and you're not bound by it in the way that you
yeah.
habitually are.
Because I was still looking out at the world. I could see people moving around the way they normally do. It wasn't like sped up or slowed down. It was just there's this other thing going on. So while I could see all that in time passing, I was somehow having a different experience at the same time. Um,
Yeah.
so I guess there was,
And
yeah.
and you mentioned the sort of rush component of it to it, which is like the sort of externally dramatic part of it, but it doesn't sound like the content of like, oh, my face is flush and like that seems secondary to this other thing, or
Yes.
maybe I'm overlaying that on the experience, but yeah.
So it was actually too much. It was like I wasn't able to contain the level of like sensory experience that I had, and like it just kind of blew my fuse almost. Basically, it's like a that's why I had to go lie down, and I crashed afterwards. I was like sad for 2 hours, that kind of thing. Maybe like I had a sudden like serotonin rush or something, just like whatever it
Okay.
was. Um, but I definitely remember like people laughing at me for going bright red and that kind of thing, and that it wasn't like that wasn't the experience. That was like a thing that came with it almost. That the core thing was this experience of non-conceptual vastness, and my
Yep.
body got like the hell is going on kind of response at the same time.
Yeah.
Felt very lovely.
So-
It sounds almost like a jhana experience, although I haven't accessed jhana outside of in a meditation
or like
context.
or like a kundalini thing, which is not something I have any fluency with, but people will talk about
Indeed,
these things then. Yeah.
indeed,
Yeah.
it was that kind of energetic thing going on as opposed to anything else. I think hasn't happened since, but I just think I wasn't prepared for it at the time. It was too early in my journey, I think, for it to be
Yeah.
integrated. So it was just like something overflowed somewhere, basically, I think.
Yeah. Okay. So the Dzogchen claim, insofar as we're like talking about the same thing,
Yeah.
there are these two pieces to it of the non-conceptual vastness, which I think is a great way of putting it. Like Chapman has a great article called "Vaster Than Ideology," where
Mm-hmm.
he's talking about it's not that you can't use or understand systems; it's that you are vaster than them.
Yes. Okay.
You're not
Nice.
bound by them. But he's using it as a sort of kind of a metaphor, but he obviously coming from a Dzogchen influenced place. But okay, so this non-conceptual vastness part of the experience, and then the Kundalini awakening, whatever it is, energetic kind of the experience that was a little overwhelming, that made you sad later, that made your face flush red.
Mm-hmm.
The Dzogchen claim would be that energetic version that's going to come and go, beholden to conditions. That non-conceptual vastness thing is true right now.
Yeah.
And it's only because it's sort of tiled over by concepts and dualistic fixation that you're not noticing it. And then when you can recognize that it's coincident with any kind of ordinary experience, and you really don't want to get into the trick of convincing yourself, oh, I need to get back to that Kundalini awakening because then I got this. That would be the mistake, right? It's like it's like you could be having an ordinary conversation and it's already true, and
that jives a lot with me when because I'm practicing the AT thing. Kind of, it's an all the time thing. It's not an on the cushion thing. There's no cushion involved. It's just inactivity. The moments I've had it really kind of ramp up was when I'm just walking around going about my business. So one time walking to work, and one time like leaving a subway station in London, just like had this experience of oneness just happen on the commute to work. Ultimately, both times, going like, okay, this is not a state in which I would be looking for an experience of non-conceptual vastness. And in those instances, I didn't get the body rush. I just got more like what I've read described as Kensho, ultimately, a kind of switching of the inside and outside, and like the outside and inside are made of the same stuff kind of experience. And like I wasn't looking for them at that point. I was just like practicing my practice, and it happened to happen, if you like. I don't think I could function so easily if that were always the state, which is interesting. Like going to work and then getting to work, I'm like, okay, I have to do emails now. I don't want non-conceptual vastness while trying to reply to someone's bitchy email. Maybe I do. I don't know. But
because they're in principle in conflict, or because I think so. Again, the Dzogchen claim would be that it's possible to integrate it. It might take it in the same way that like integrating a psychedelic experience would take some work. Like we're so used to doing intellectual work or doing anything right, and do anything that things require doing, being incompatible with this vastness and this sense of non-doing and the sense of non-separation and whatever else. But if it's the prior context of any experience of concepts or whatever else that you're going to have, it's already true that you're doing all those things in that context. And you can sort of shift your plane of identification or non-identification as the case may be. And then once you sort of get used to it, the claim would be if you're resting in non-conceptual vastness and you can't then go do something, you're inhibiting the other side of it. So remember I said this inseparability of emptiness and clarity, where clarity is this spontaneous knowing and arising quality of form. There are two ways you can be confused. The usual way people are confused is they lose sight of the emptiness component of it. But another way you can be confused is sort of subtly fixating the emptiness of something and not allowing things to arise, right? And so that's why it's the gold standard, is like they're inseparable all the time. And
okay, I follow that. So if I like retranslate my experience, I make no claims to be enlightened or able to do this reliably. This is not my usual state to be in that.
I'll make this claim on your behalf.
So I suspect that in those moments I was sufficiently unskilled to handle them, in the sense that I could then integrate them into have that state and also do emails at the same time, right? And
you also have to have a conceptual frame that says that's possible, right?
Yes, which I didn't have until now, actually. I'm aware that we talked about Douglas Harding and you wanted to come back to it. Do you want to talk about Douglas Harding and the idea of no head, and we can go from there?
Sure. Yeah, I'd forgotten that you use it in the course, but okay. So basically, Douglas Harding was a British architect who grew up in some sort of very strict puritanical Christian community or something like that, and eventually abandoned it, but then did a bunch of spiritual seeking, and then his seeking culminated in this experience that he described as having no head, where I think it happened to him in a few different contexts, but the one he sort of wrote about as the primary example is he's looking out over the Himalayas, and suddenly he has this experience that he describes as headlessness, not of literal headlessness, but of his head not being an object in awareness. And then suddenly there's just the world, unstained of any you. And he uses this phrase that I said earlier, vast emptiness, vastly filled, which is like, it's a void. It's a total
Mm.
void hanging in nothingness. It's not propped up by anything. It's just hanging there in the void. And yet it's vastly filled in that when you're not there, all that's left is just the whole world, the whole visual scene, all of it. And it takes on this sort of intense vividness. But again, it's very tricky to describe in what the vividness consists, because it's not that it literally gets brighter.
Mm-hmm.
It's like the lumens of awareness itself get turned up in
Yeah.
some sense, and in that sense, it's more vivid. Anyway, the experience of headlessness is, I would say, like an almost Alexander Technique style uh, stroke of genius in terms of colloquial ways of teaching things that would otherwise put people off because they come in a sort of Buddhist context. So the book that he wrote about this was On Having No Head, Zen and the Rediscovery of the Obvious, or something like that is the name of the title. So he was connecting it eventually to, stuff that gets taught in various, Buddhist and Hindu non-dual traditions. But headlessness as a way of putting it can draw people into the insight that wouldn't otherwise get it, because they're, what the hell does non-dual mean, or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just a very helpful practice instruction. But that's, yeah.
The book is excellent. Anyone reading who hasn't read it, it's short, it's hilarious. Actually, the way he describes this stuff is just like, you actually just burst into laugh. I just like laugh out loud at many parts of his descriptions of things, like the obviousness that I had no head. Like, it sounds ludicrous, but when you get what he's pointing at, it's wonderful.
Yeah, and people can do this. Okay, so there are different ways that you can sort of get into the experience. But okay, so one is to imagine that you have no head. So just look out at the world and imagine that you have no head. Another is to notice. Okay, so bring your attention or your awareness, the sort of focus of your awareness. Okay, so it's out here in front of you, and you can sort of have it travel backward into the region of space in which your head is supposed to be, and you won't find anything there. You will find it just like passes into like nothingness. So out there in that direction, there's color, there's light, there's stuff. Back here in this direction, it just passes into void. Another amazing sort of trick that I love with this is, okay, so take your hands and put them like this. You see your hands in your peripheral vision. I'm sure you've done this before, Michael, but okay, so and then just slowly move your hands back, but keep them in your peripheral vision. And eventually they will pass out of your peripheral vision, but not into darkness, but into literal nothing. like as nothing ever gets. They just pass out of being in some important sense. And all of those can sort of point you in the direction of what he means by headlessness, which is that, like, you think you're over here perched behind your eyes in some solid position, but actually what's in that direction is just void. And then there's just the world.
Yeah. And the tricks that he developed are so direct and useful that it's astonishing actually how he came up with it. So the main one is, and go and read the book, but there's a précis is basically you take your finger and you point your finger back at your own eyes, and you look at the finger like, okay, there's my finger over there, and then you swap places. You place the looker over here and kind of look back at yourself, and there's a moment in which I kind of call it like a cognitive error message, almost like it does not compute, like a wobble almost, and that wobble is like into
the phrase in Dzogchen and various is the not finding is the finding.
Yeah,
exactly. You cannot find anything in a way that's decisive.
Yes,
like okay. So all of this would, in a Dzogchen context, be put under the rubric of what are called pointing out instructions, which is that somebody, just like a teacher, will guide you through and point out this fact about awareness. And you can either do it as sort of an immediate way or in a slightly stepwise way. So Locke Kelly will do this thing where he calls them glimpse practices, but it's like, okay, you unfixate, you go to local awareness and then global awareness, and then you notice you're aware as that. Like, he'll sort of do it in steps, but you can also do it in a sort of instantaneous way. And all of these are pointing out what's already true of awareness, right? It's not like you had a head and then you lost it. It's that you
never had
you notice what was already true.
Yeah. There's something I haven't fully elucidated, but I want to make a bit clearer in the course and other materials, is there's an AT concept called direction. So you have inhibition, you have direction. So while you're inhibiting, you're also directing. And this is what is normally taught in traditional Alexander technique as a series of verbal orders or instructions, in the sense of, as in like directions to yourself almost. So allow the neck to be free such that the head can go forward and up, and the shoulders can lengthen and widen, and the knees can go forward and away. I don't teach this way. I don't use this. It's whatever. I think there's been a bit of reification going on between, or maybe not reification, but kind of mistranslation between what Alexander meant and his words of that and the actual experience, where while you're going through these words, there's a mental move that you're making, which conveniently translates into 3 dimensions of projecting yourself into space almost. So it's not just awareness of there is space here, there's whatever, these directions. It's allowing those things to move to activating the idea of direction in all those axes. So in the having no head, and it's very hard to like put into words, but in the having no head example, you have the finger pointing, and there's a couple of different moves. So if I just aim my finger up instead, you've got the finger, fine, and then you've got the looking move almost, but in between that, there's the idea of direction. There's the idea that there's a direction of up. It's not actually a line. It's not actually
from your finger, not from your attention to your finger. Yeah, it's from the finger up.
Wherever the finger is pointing at. So he does it this way. So there's the finger, and then there's an awareness this way, but there's the idea of this way. And it's not like imagining lines. It's not anything else. It's just like the idea, the concept, or the tangibility of a direction, of a dimension,
like a vector in space,
like a zero vector or something. Just like the vector exists, right? Yeah. And what's interesting, I think this is what Alexander was playing with these directions, is that if your awareness is expanded and then you activate the vector of up without actually doing anything in your body, you find that your body aligns itself differently, because you're a being in space rather than a being looking at space almost. Like you are part of the vector of the world almost. And when you're directing, there's this lengthening process, there's a widening process that you're not doing. You're not using muscle, but like, oh yeah, there's an idea of verticality, and I can kind of like drift up in it. And I've not seen this expressed in any kind of Buddhist like teaching, but I know that I can switch the thing on and switch on the kind of the body's anti-gravity system, if you like, as opposed to the body slumping and then using muscle to fight the slumping almost. It's like the cessation of slumping versus the doing of holding oneself up almost.
Yeah, I don't know that I'm aware of this sort of. So there is. I mean, so that the Harding technique of turning awareness upon itself in this kind of momentary effect, like crucially, it can't become an extended gesture of like I'm really pointing, because that's the wrong thing. Yeah. It's this momentary turning in place of. It's a little bit different, but I think it's a similar gesture where, okay, so the ordinary experience is there is a kind of directionality, and it's traveling toward whatever you're attending to in this kind of like intense arrow of directedness from that is your attention, right? It's this sort of tubular, like I'm aiming at whatever I'm aiming at thing. And then the pointing out instruction that one would get is, okay, instantaneously as a momentary gesture, and then once you do the gesture, you don't keep doing it, you just drop. Like let go is turn awareness upon itself. So just look back toward whatever's looking, and then let go. And then for an instant there, you can just rest beyond referentiality, sort of. But that's the only context in which I've heard that sort of, as you say, like zero vector in space or an awareness type thing. I haven't heard it in the context of reorganizing your sort of physical system around it. But I've found myself doing that. Or so like when I'm like sitting like this at my computer, I'll kind of go, okay, like from here, like let everything kind of reorganize in a certain way.
It's kind of the aliveness thing. So I often use the language of like such that you could almost. So there's one thing to be aware of the space above me. I'm aware of the space above me, and there's an awareness of the space such that I could move into it. You know, that I'm an agent within the space as opposed to just sitting in the space. Like such that I could is such a different state of being in. Like I call this, I think actually Tashin coined this at the training weekend he came to in London, of coulddness. It's right now, could I stand up? Is yes, I could. I'm not going to. I'm inhibiting my coulddness. I'm not going to stand up. But the fact that I could changes how I'm being. Right now, I could not stand up, and I've diminished my couldness, and I've diminished myself in a sense. So almost what we're looking for is globally maximize couldness, inhibiting everything except that which you actually want to do, right?
Which is the same thing as global unfixation, which we talked about before.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Yeah. I never quite thought in this way about the relationship between awareness and agency, and like the because there is a like that subtle directionality in awareness that you're talking about, tied to the possibility of acting or perceiving in a particular direction, is that kind of subtle agency thing too, in a strange way. I don't quite know how to think about it, but yeah, that doesn't have a. I mean, things about spontaneity certainly have reference in different Buddhist traditions. I'm not aware of this direction thing because there wasn't the same emphasis on posture and everything else. You know,
I think this is one for me to dig into and write more about. I think because no one's yet said, oh, it's this thing. Part of what I'm doing here is like put myself in the world, and someone says, oh yeah, that's just this, and on this stuff, no one said that yet. So
yeah, but I would also encourage. I mean, so I understood, and I think you should definitely write more about it. But I would also encourage you to. There's a ton, and as Harding proves, like I'm very glad that Harding didn't go, oh, that's just Rigpa. I guess I don't have to write any books about it. You know what I mean? Like I'm really glad that he is like, no, it's headless, because there's a ton of value in finding new language and new gestures and all of that. So doesn't matter if it exists elsewhere. There was something else I was going to say about awareness. Shocker. Hold on. I'm going to remember. Oh, okay. So, sorry, I knew it was going to come to me. You were talking before about this is not an on the cushion practice for you. It's just an in the world type practice, and there's no firm boundary between practice and life.
No.
And that's another big thing that I know people get out of Alexander technique, that who are otherwise frustrated with meditation, is that it's not a thing you sit on the cushion and force yourself to do. It's a thing that's available to you at any moment of the day. I think that's also true of meditation, but there's especially some of the sort of preliminary practices that people get taught in meditation of you got to get concentrated on the breath so that you can notice certain things about it. And concentration is predicated on a certain kind of momentum. That all seems to be like, okay, unless you're sitting on the cushion, what's really available to you now? Not very much. That's not true, crucially, of these non-dual practices. Again, because the claim is that it's always already true of awareness. And in Dzogchen, they specifically have this word non-meditation, where the practice moves in the direction of you don't want it to be like a meditation. You don't want to have any sense of there being a separation between any kind of practice and what you're doing in the world. And teachers will have you explicitly like shake off the stink of practice, so like you're doing it, you're like, okay, like let me notice I have no head, and you'll get into this as it's exactly the same thing as your Alexander technique is letting go of whatever you think Alexander technique is. It's like you will get into this mode of, oh, I learned that if I do this turn awareness upon itself gesture, oh, that'll give me this experience of headlessness. And it's like, no, like shake it off, like forget that, like go do a lap around the block. Who cares if you stay concentrated? Don't trick yourself into thinking it's dependent on these rarefied conditions to notice. So there's a similar emphasis there.
This is really fascinating, because in my training and the way that we do things is, okay, go describe the scene. Most of our training is hands-on, but once you're sufficiently good, basically you have your hand on someone's back and they can tell the quality of your awareness, basically. Like you're directly transmitting awareness and this sense of whatever this thing is we're talking about. So normally how I teach in this context is I'm the student, they have their hand on my back, and I'm like, not that, do something else, kind of like pointing out all the ways in which they're getting stuck, because somehow I assume there's a mechanism, I don't know what it is, but I can pick up on what their awareness is doing through touch, or through, like, I can't see them, but that's going on. And it's so interesting to see people get stuck in the teacher role, because they're trying all these different things to get back into that state that they think is Alexander technique. And one of the best ways of getting out of that is just that they could yell at them, put your hands on and don't do Alexander technique. just stand there. And then it's like, thank you, that's what I was looking for, that's the thing. Right? And it's like,
Yeah.
why, they laugh, they giggle, they suddenly unfixate, they can move again, they start breathing because they've let go of trying to do the thing that they thought they were trying to do, and it
Yeah.
works.
And
And it's that moment.
this will often be true at the end of somebody's meditation. It's like, okay, the time's up, and then you're like, okay, I'm done meditating, thank God, and you have the most free moment,
Yes.
2 seconds that you've had the whole meditation
Exactly.
or something like that. There was so I'm very intrigued about this phenomenon of transmission of awareness that happens. This, I'm not sure the physical analog is as big a thing, like this thing of putting your hand on your back, but their experiences, and I've never had this experience. I would love to have this experience if I could find somebody to induce it. But I was talking to somebody recently who had this. There's a spiritual teacher, sort of fallen spiritual teacher named Andrew Cohen, who had a sort of whole community that fell apart as spiritual communities do. But he was famous for, and is famous for, the person I was talking to was in his community, but was not like, did not find him personally charismatic at all. And yet you'd sit in a group with this guy and he would induce in the group this like vast, non-conceptual vastness, just like by his very presence, and everybody would be in it. The guy was explaining his first encounter. He's like, I sat in this meeting. I'm like, this guy's, he's got like a New Jersey accent. He's very like, like unimpressive to me. And that doesn't, make me want to give up my life and follow him. He's like, and then I walked outside and I instantaneously had an experience of cosmic consciousness descend upon me. It was just like ludicrous things like this.
Wow.
And this is so fascinating to me, because I can no longer doubt that it's real. Like, people clearly have these experiences. Certain, like, you'll know too, like there's like Punjaji, who's this guy, Andrew Cohen's teacher, is famous for having had the similar quality of being able to induce certain states in his students, which has a pitfall too, because then you come to associate it with the teacher and all this other stuff. But and then there are other teachers that are better teachers, arguably conceptually, in terms of like really giving the clear instruction, but can't do this like, I'm going to induce in you a thing. But it's interesting that it's actually part and parcel of the Alexander technique pedagogy that like, at least to some extent, that's happening, albeit through physical touch. But
yeah, it's really interesting because how do I phrase this? I'm a little bit annoyed at a lot of the profession for just doing the hands-on stuff and not kind of digging into like, what's actually going on here? Like, how is this? What are you talking, like, crazy stuff? And I was talking to someone about this recently who's aware of the traditional way of teaching, and he says, like, most teachers are like, they have good touch, they have excellent touch, they can guide people into certain experiences, but they don't then actually like help the student to like understand what's going on. And I'm kind of in the reverse position because I don't have much of a hands-on practice because I'm nomading around. It's not my job almost, but I have this online course, so I'm better and better at articulating and guiding people into it from other methods, and my touch is a bit less practiced. But most of the profession is come in, teacher puts their hands largely here and like makes a small change in the atlanto-occipital joint where the skull meets the spine, and you have an experience of what I think is non-fixation. Like, you can unfixate the body, and that causes unfixation in awareness. Like, they're the same process.
because they're not
because
separate.
it's the same thing ultimately. If you notice, like, when you fixate meditation, just check your posture, check your breathing. Like, you're holding your breath, your muscle tension, and you're just looking in one spot, and your eyes are like pointed, right?
And what's the first thing that you'll get told to do is in meditation is relax your body, and like, even it's actually both sides of it, right? So it's why do you sit up straight on a cushion? It's, you want the alertness of one part of the posture, but the utter relaxation, and the kind of combination of relaxation and alertness is there in the posture, and that translates to it being in there in the mind, and you can't draw a firm distinction between those two.
Exactly. And from an AT perspective, I would say to meditators is, when you have the posture in meditation, it's not a fixated one from my perspective. It's even if you're not moving, there needs to be availability in your system, even if it's the subtlest of movements, or the fact that you could move must still remain there. Otherwise, you're fixated.
So I can imagine interpreting that instruction in two different ways, because one of the relaxation instructions that Michael Taft will often give is like, surrender any sense that you're about to do anything with your hands. Like your hands are always kind of in this condition of maybe I have to go type something, maybe I have to go pick something up.
Yeah.
And he's like, let your hands be like wet rags, just like
Huh, yeah.
totally useless. And that's a good, it starts to differentiate the finger pointing at the moon relaxation versus the like intrinsic quality of awareness relaxation. You know what I mean? Like
Yes.
where it's like the freedom is not really a sort of physical freedom of like you're about to do something with your hands. In
Yeah.
some sense it's a different kind of agency that you're untapping or something like that, because I
Yeah.
don't think you want to like have the sense of like when you're sitting, oh, I might have to get up any minute or something like that. You really want to just like
No.
surrender. Yeah.
Yeah. This is getting outside of my. I don't know why Americans say wheelhouse. But it's outside of my wheelhouse. I have no idea what a wheelhouse is, but all the smart
I've only
podcast
heard
people
that in
say
terms of the
wheelhouse.
context. Yeah, I say it all the time. I say this is on my wheel. Yeah,
But yeah, I guess there's something around surrender that leads to spontaneity. So that if you wanted to move, you could, but you're just not going to. It's not like I must maintain a fixed posture. I'm not allowed to move. Is a very different state from like I'm unfixated and a surrendered. I'm just not going to move, but I could state. But I think this is worth me thinking about some more before I make proclamations from my Alexander technique, ivory tower.
your perch. Yeah,
exactly.
I'm wondering, should we before we wrap up talk about grand global visions
I
of
was
unfixation?
about to raise exactly the same thing. Yeah. So
okay. Yeah.
do you want to start since you raised it? Like, why is unfixation relevant to
No,
like global society stuff? I'm glad that you opened it because now I can ask you the question.
Okay. So I've been it's not that you needed much nudging, but I've been nudging you in this direction because obviously you've got this background working on climate science stuff and or I should say climate change policy rather, not climate science exactly, but and also this strange excursion into AT, and are hoping to find a way to meld the two. And there is this interesting. Okay, so maybe McGilchrist would be an interesting way in, right? McGilchrist's dramatic claim is that many of the pathologies of Western civilization have to do with the emissary, that is the left hemisphere, that is attention, and the particular vision of the world that attention gives, losing sight of its status as the servant of the right hemisphere, that is awareness, that is this sort of more holistic way of perceiving things. And I am less comfortable than many in spiritual world with like kind of woo woo ecological, like everything's one, we're one with Nate, like this stuff doesn't really like it doesn't inspire me in the same way. But the general picture of being able to come unfixated in ideological space, in solution space, in kind of in possible future vision space, all these things, because they're fundamentally not different gestures, right? If you think about what it's like to be really captured by an ideology and a picture of somebody else as being the enemy, or to be really working hard to try to figure out some solution to a global problem and seeing no outs, and then the future sort of foreclosing around you in that way, which is like arguably far too true of sort of climate change activism at the moment, which is like it's this like sense of a foreshortened future. It's just like everything, like the possibilities are getting narrower and narrower and narrower. We've been fucked forever, and like it, and the fear is that if you really sort of like let go of that, then like you fall into the void. And it's like, no, actually the letting go is the thing that will allow new possibilities to come up, and they always come up. Like, you're not dead. New possibilities will always come up. And so anyway, I like anything that's this deeply true of our psychology has to also have larger scale implications. I think
it's manifesting out there as in so without as within so without, I think, is part of the
as above so below, or
exactly. So I guess anyone who doesn't know me, I spent 10 years working in low carbon energy policy, technology, that kind of stuff. And then this weird excursion into Alexander technique. So I see the same thing. There's a frame in AT of the means whereby and end gaining, where this is Edwardian language, but the more you fixate on the end you wish to gain, on your goal, the more you compromise your use of yourself. Ultimately, the more you get the more you introduce muscle tension, the more you kind of do things in an unoptimal way. And the way to get out of that is to pay attention to let go of the end you want to gain, and pay attention to the means whereby. So in more like modern language, that basically means like, yes, have a sense of your goal, but be more interested in how you get there, as opposed to the need, the craving to like achieve that goal at all cost. So I've kind of changed my position on the idea that, you know, I now think the means never justify the ends, because, or rather, the ends never justify the means. Sorry, because in that state, you will have worse means, right? You will allow things to happen that you would never otherwise happen if you cared about the means. So there's something here around that couldness, around...
And there's always only means too, in some important...
Exactly. The ends never really happen. No end. In a sense. The ends never happen, but the more you fixate on the end, the more you lose options with your means, ultimately. And you can try this in real life. Like, the more important you make it to pick something up or to finish a project, like, the more you will get stuck in your familiar ways of doing it. And this is what interests me about the climate change story is, I think it was Einstein who said that you can't solve a problem with the same level of thinking that created it, or if not him, someone said that. We have that kind of thing now, is that we have a problem that was created by a certain kind of thinking, and we have to get out of it with a different kind of thinking, which will by definition feel unfamiliar. So the harder we try, the more we emphasize the familiar and the more we get ourselves stuck. Ironically, the less we try, or the more we let go of the end we want to gain, the more we can do unfamiliar things. And one example I'm finding of this in the climate space is, well, okay, fine, you can try really, really hard to decarbonize, you can try really hard to invest and have policies for renewables, or you could stop subsidizing fossil fuels and do nothing else, right? Like, stop doing bad things and see what else happens is a very different thing from do bad things and try to also do good things, right? You can just stop doing all the things and see what comes up in the system that you're leaving alone.
I think I sent this to you a lot before we'd had any of these conversations. It's another Varela clip where he's on some panel. This is a couple decades ago, so I think it predates climate change stuff. But just thinking about, probably was thinking about some sort of environmental issue, and he's like, before you ask yourself how can I help, you have to ask yourself how can I stop bothering, which is like, that was his summary of like what is the spiritual contribution to, you know, activist discourse. He's like, before you ask how can I help, ask how can I stop bothering. And it's just like, there's probably something you can non-do before you aggressively try to fix it.
Totally. There was a similar one of Alan Watts's talks when he was talking about he was invited to a conference of important people, he says, and they were talking about environmental degradation, they were talking about what kind of humans do we need for the future. Like, let's say we have like genetic engineering, we can like shape different kinds of people. What kind of people should we have? And he was like, oh, whatever you do, make sure you have like a lot of different kinds of people, because you never know. Because too much of any one thing is bad. And he framed this in terms of, he can very well imagine a pestilence of saints, ultimately. And that really made me think about the environmental movement. Because a pestilence of saints, of like enough people thinking like, we need to do X. And or maybe, but it might not be X, and X could be getting in the way. And the way that you're getting to X, environmentalists, could be so much worse than what actually needs to be done. So,
well, at the very least, what you get is a bunch of people who think that the most important thing in the world is climate change, which, even if it is, will lead to certain solutions to climate change that will inevitably leave out certain kinds of things. Like, you know, like what effect would aggressive decarbonization have on developing countries that like need to industrialize as well, and need to, you know, like there are all sorts of ways that this would show up. But it's like, if you have people who are myopically focused on a particular thing, that will not even be effective for solving that particular thing, or if it is, it will introduce all sorts of other externalities and issues.
Right.
And,
because in the Alexander technique frame, the more you fixate on the end you wish to gain, the more your awareness collapses around that thing. So you lose sight of the means whereby, yes, but you also miss everything else that's going on, and you can't pay attention to those things because your attention is constrained by your collapsed awareness. So let's say that you solve for climate change, but as you say, you impoverish billions of people or X, Y, and Z because you've like focused so much. It's like there's a video, if you haven't seen it, on YouTube of a boy cycling down a hill, and like towards some trees, and the dad just yelling, "Don't hit the tree! Don't hit the tree!" And the boy cycles straight into a tree. Dad
Yeah.
starts laughing, whatever. Like, it's an obvious. We know it's the experience of you go where you're looking, and then you can't unfixate from the tree because you're so fixated on tree, you're going to hit the tree. And we're doing the same thing, I think, with all kinds of modern issues. Is that we're so scared about certain outcomes that we're fixating on the outcomes, and we're
rushing
going
into the
towards
outcome.
we're rushing faster and faster towards the outcomes. you know.
Yeah. Yeah.
So there's a move, I think, that we're both seeing of like, how do we get society to unfixate, to go like, yeah, we care about those outcomes, and we want to move towards fixing those outcomes in such a way as we could do something else at the same time. Like, we're not like stuck on this track. But how do you turn unfixation from a felt meditation move or an awareness move into a institutional move, into a societal move, into a political move ultimately, and how that can be seen as a good thing even?
There's another term from Buddhist world here. The fixation in a sort of Buddhist context means dualistic fixation, where the kind of primary dualistic fixation is, I guess the first would be separating emptiness from form, but then also subject and object, subject-object fixation. Like, I'm over here, the world's over there.
Yeah.
But that it also manifests in all these other sort of dualisms of good and bad that you erect and experience. And I kind of think about this with respect to political disputes too. Like, dualistic fixation perpetuates itself.
Yeah.
And my primary interest in applying some of this unfixation stuff is to sort of political debates. But I mean, take something like climate change. Like, the people I know in my life who are, like, reflexively skeptical of climate change things, or were in the early like, oh, climate change is a hoax, whatever. Those people, they're not really committed to the claim that climate change is a hoax. What they're committed to is the idea that it would be a really bad idea to tank the economy because of your pet issue. You know what I mean? You know what I mean? Like, oh, let's undo many, centuries of industrial progress because Al Gore got excited about something. I'm purposely strawmanning this, but like, sure. That's the frame. And the point is, the thing on which they are fixated is also a fixation. I'm not gonna dispute that. But it's a different fixation. And then in both cases, like, the climate change focused person just thinks that person hates the environment,
exactly.
and like, is evil, and the whatever, having an industrial economy person just thinks that the climate change person is a mindless hippie with no concern for like the actual conditions of material prosperity, whatever. Like they can both get in this view of one another that non-fixation it allows you to see your issue within a larger context, which then fuses your horizons with people who might care about different issues, but could be made to be interested in your issue if they could do the same.
Yeah, I agree, and that you even see that within the movement almost. So on the one hand, your example is climate change believers, and then don't tank the economy. There's internal battles around, well, I see your batteries just died. Amazing. We knew it would happen. See how good the iMac camera is. So
continue.
Yes. On the one hand, you have, how do we solve climate change? There's two options. One is, let's fully deindustrialize, go back to the earth, return, like local organic farming for all.
Return of the bee.
Yeah. And on the other hand, you have like the let's invest in technology, put money into innovation, technology will save the world, geoengineering, all the kind of like stuff, right? And those two are fixations, and they never see eye to eye. And when I first thought about this, you got there's a book called The Wizard and the Prophet, which talks about this, or The Prophet and the Wizard, one of the two way around.
I think it's Wizard and the Prophet, the Charles something, yeah.
Yes, exactly. And I kind of saw like, the Buddhist frame of the middle way is actually very relevant in all of these dichotomies, because I don't think that the Buddha meant neither that way nor that, neither asceticism nor like indulgence. I think he meant like, don't be fixated on either of these things and be able to like move freely between them in an unfixated way. It's the same in the climate change movement of, perhaps it's neither full deindustrialization and degrowth or full technology. It's the fact that we're not stuck on any one narrative. So I would like to see a huge plurality of positive stories of different ways of the future could go, and like allow society's awareness to expand to include more possibilities in it, such that we're more likely to behave in a way that will land us somewhere good, as opposed to be like, the world is melting and but that's just it. We have to do these things because the world is melting. Yeah, the world might be melting. That's fair enough. It's probably true in some sense. It's the way that we relate to that fact that will change how we actually behave and deal with it. And I think we'll get a better world if we don't fixate on the bad stuff.
Yeah. Well, and a genuinely like open future, right? Because like you're not foreclosing a sort of possibility landscape. But the interesting challenge for those of us who are inclined toward this style of thinking of like why don't we just have the best of both, or this kind of thing, is to avoid. Chapman talks about this in the context of the middle way. He's like, avoid muddled middles, which is this like oh, I don't want the bad parts of that, and I don't want bad parts of this, so I'll just end up in a soup with no definable characteristics. You know what I mean? Like the tricky thing, because obviously you and I are on the same side of this in the sense of seeing the potential here, and the pitfall is it's almost analogous to that fixation of emptiness pitfall in non-dual awareness that we were talking about before. Of don't have any don't make any definite claims, or don't have any definite characteristics, or don't do any definite conceptualizing, lest you obscure your vast view, right? Like it's like
right.
Like my view can stay perfectly unstained as long as I don't commit to any particular policy, or whatever. As long as I don't suggest anything. Like my view is vast as the sky and can contain all of your views, none of which I will actually endorse. That's the very tricky thing. Is like, can you have? There's a phrase, I can't remember. It's like Long Chenpa or one of these Dzogchen people is, view as vast as the sky, conduct as fine as barley flour, which is like you want both. You want have the vast view, but then
and also
let it allow you to engage in very precise action rather than very nebulous, useless action.
Yeah. It's the ultimate both and thing, I guess. So I see we're coming up on 2 hours, and I rarely watch podcasts that go beyond 2 hours of YouTube videos. But
okay.
Let's wrap there. I will say thank you very much for the amazing conversation. I really enjoyed it. And I suspect we have it in us to do a part 2 at some point. We'll see what people say, if anything, they want to see more of. So thank you.
This has been an absolute blast, man. My pleasure. Thank you.
Cool. So until next time.
Take care.